Well, brief reminder before we get into what we're going to talk about today about what we've been covering the last couple of weeks. We've been talking a lot about the values that Newground Church has. And in our first week, we talked about Scripture and the approach that we should take with humility and be careful in applying certainty to all of our beliefs. We learned context. Then week 2, we discussed the benefit of asking questions, about being curious, how the church should create safe spaces for people within the church to exercise skepticism and doubt. Now this morning we're going to transition into the next value, which is authentic community. It's something that I'm particularly passionate about. And before we jump into the text that we're going to read this morning, which is going to be out of Acts, I want to prepare some context for us so that we can better understand what it is that we're going to be reading this morning and kind of have a little bit of a timeline here before what we're going to jump into here in Acts. If you're unfamiliar with the book of Acts, it was authored by Luke. And Acts is actually part of the Gospel of Luke, and the original manuscripts are one book, and oftentimes called the book of Luke Acts. So Acts is just a continuation of Luke. Now, if we were to have a timeline and begin with the resurrection of Jesus, we have about 40 days where he's just out there chilling. And then after that, he ascends to heaven. And then the disciples are like, now what do we do? Like, we have all this responsibility, and what does that look like? What are we going to do with that? So they go back to have more discussions about this in their home in Jerusalem. The Jews begin celebrating their Feast of Weeks, which is also called the Shavuot, also referred to as Pentecost, which we're familiar with and also celebrate. But it was called Pentecost because it was celebrated 50 days after the first festival, which was the Feast of First Fruits. And we're going to pick up here in a minute after most of you are familiar with the sermon that Peter preaches to all the masses of the people who are there for the festival. He goes off we have this scenario where these tongues of fire come down and rest upon the disciples' head in Jerusalem, and they begin speaking different languages representing all of the people that are there. 15 different people groups representing various countries and cultures. And then as a result of that, some 3,000 men, it specifically says men, so there are also families too, begin to follow Jesus. That's great, right? 3,000 people. You have like this big altar call, you have 3,000 people coming down to follow Jesus. Now what do? You got all these people, and there's really no direction on how to handle all the diversity that you have, both in language and in culture. And that's where we're going to pick up in the passage of Acts chapter 2, verses 43 to 47. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So obviously we don't all have it together, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, is authentic community and how we can be and reflect a more real, true sense of who we are to the people around us. When reading this passage, the first question I have is, why did they choose these values? What was it like? Where did they come up with this idea to do church this way? Because they didn't have a lot of time to think about this. They preached the sermon, all these people began following Jesus, and then all of a sudden, now what do we do with all these people, right? So, I mean, they didn't have books on church planting or Google or anything like that back then, so they really just had their experience and whatever their ideas were on how to manage all of these people. What Luke is referring to in this text here, when we're talking about community, there's a good Greek word that's oftentimes that pastors will talk about called koinonia. And koinonia refers to the intimate spiritual communion of believers that jointly participate in the ongoing ministry of Jesus. So Luke describes the attributes of koinonia in this passage, like being devoted to the apostles' teaching, being devoted to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, to prayer, to giving to the fellowship, to giving to everyone in need. So why these values? What is it about? I mean, there are other great values that could have been included in here, so why these ones? Because it was all they knew, right? So if they're operating on their level of experience, they came up with these values because these are the values that they were taught by Jesus. Even though this passage is oftentimes talked about as the start of the church, really the start of the church has its roots in the teachings of Jesus. And they used these values because they viewed them as the most important values that Jesus taught. And there are a couple of words or phrases that I want to draw our attention to that are specifically geared towards what we're talking about here this morning. And the first word is common. All the believers were together and they had everything in common, is how the verse talks about. And then the other one, the phrase sincere hearts, which we'll talk about after that. But all believers were together and had everything in common. That took me a while to digest. What does it mean to have everything in common? Does it mean that they just gave up their lives and just started living together like a commune? Or what exactly did it mean for them to have things in common? So after all the word studies and research, two things that I was able to ascertain that they're talking about when they refer to the word common. And the first one is commitment. They were committed to the gospel as their common message, more specifically the resurrection. That was a big deal for them theologically, the resurrection. And for them, and really for us too, the story in the gospel of Jesus has no meaning without the resurrection. The resurrection is the key, because anybody can come and say what they want to say about God. I mean, if Jesus just dies, he's not God, right? So something else has to happen in order for him to really have that title as God. And so the resurrection was a big deal to them, and that's what they preached, because a lot of people knew who Jesus was, but what they preached was, by the way, he's still alive. He didn't die. And that was their message that they would preach. The second thing has to do with power. As has been the case throughout history, things like land and property create power and wealth. It creates a separation of class. It's necessary, so it became necessary for some people to sell their possessions. And some people were very wealthy. And so they created this sort of persona of equality within the group of all these 3,000 people, so that there wasn't one who had more power over another. So commitment, they were committed to the gospel. That was their common thread that held them together. And power, they obliterated power and got rid of it so that they all were equal. Now, I know this is much different than Western thinking today. In fact, the church has really had done the very opposite. It's really sought after power, political, financial, and it's sort of resulted in this elitism that exists within the church at large, within our culture. The second thing I want us to look at from that passage is sincere hearts. And the passage, the verse that's in is, they broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. What does it mean for a church community to be authentic, and why is it so hard for the church to accomplish? The church is probably one of the fakest places that people exist in. And there are reasons for why I think at least, my opinion, that the church has operated this way for so long. There's an individual level. At the individual level, it's risky. It requires us to put ourselves out there. It concedes the possibility of being betrayed and judged by others. However, by creating an authentic community, those who are judgmental are less than those who are seeking authentic community and are non-judgmental. And so the people that become judgmental become less and less in an authentic community. But there's probably these two themes that can be seen in churches that lack authentic community. The first is what I call otherness. And that is, for a long time, the church has sort of just been a thing that people go to, not any different from golfing or any other activity that they may do. The other is fear. The church has not done a very good job in taking care of its people. It has used fear-based tactics for thousands of years to scare people into obedience. And we have become afraid of messing up in front of the church. So we have not taken church as seriously as we should, and we're afraid of messing up in front of others. These are sort of the two reasons that I think, at least, we lack authenticity in the church in general. Let me ask you, this is a rhetorical question, but let me ask you a question. Is your life as awesome as is portrayed on Facebook and Instagram? I know mine isn't. It's like, if I happen to get a good picture or something like that, the first thing I think about is where I can post it. If I can post it online, or if something awesome happens, to report it online to let everybody know. And that creates this sort of image that, since we're doing this on all the things that happen awesome in our life, usually, but for most people. And we've been sort of trained, I think, by the world even, to put forth the best version of ourselves to other people. And we do that, going to a play, or going to church, or going to more formal events. So I have a class reunion coming up in a couple of weeks. It's been 25 years. No, I know you can't believe that I'm that old, but I am. I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop thinking about what people will think of me, how I'm going to dress, who I'm going to sit with, and what other people are going to think about with the people that I'm sitting with. And we all have experiences like this. One that comes to mind that I think is really common is, if you ever had a kid in the store throw a fit. One of the very first things we think about, I think most people think about, is, oh my gosh, what are people going to think of my child throwing a fit? And that becomes more natural for us to think that way than it is to care about the needs of our child at that moment. We just initially think about ourselves and what other people are going to think. But why do we care so much about what other people think? Why is our worth tied up in the opinions of others? I think it's the same thing in church. We oftentimes think that the worth of our spirituality is based on what the pastor thinks of us, or what our church friends think of us, instead of what God thinks of us. So I think there's this general lie that we all have believed in. I think all of us have at some point said this to ourselves. You're the only one. I think that many of us have said that to ourselves when something happens. You're the only one that's happened to, so don't share that with anybody else. You're going to be looked at as different or less than. But that's a lie, because we all think that. And when we buy into this lie, we hold back. We never really get to know other people, and they never really get to know us. And we create just enough distance between ourselves so that we never ever really get to know each other in the ways that the church is meant to know each other. And how can we be a part of a healthy community if no one really knows you? The church as a whole has become unempathetic. It no longer says, I understand what it is that you're going through. Instead, it says, you need to be this way or think this way in order to be a Christian. If you want to be part of our group, get your life in order, and then you can come into our church, be one of us. I think that's probably one of the number one reasons why people out in the world think Christians are hypocrites. It's not because we mess up. It's because we refuse to be humble. We refuse to be who we really are and show that we're just like you. We're not any different. We mess up just like you do. It will sound counterintuitive at first, but consider that it is better for the Christian to mess up in front of non-Christians than to do so in private. That the witness of Jesus has nothing to do with the perception of our perfection. but in how you respond in situations. The church is not a place for those who have it all together. It is a place where broken people find refuge. It has to be, because there's no other place out there that's like that. Where else can you go to find refuge? It should be the church. So I'm the only Christian in my family, and a long time ago, Cindy and I decided that we were going to make it a point to live our church life more real in front of our family and not put up this facade of everything is always great, because things haven't always been great with church with us. And so you might think, well, wouldn't you want to present Jesus in this nice, beautiful little package that is attractive for people on the outside? And the answer is no. That's been our problem, I think. And I think what we should be doing instead is showing people how we mess up and how we respond in those situations, and how Jesus responds to us when we mess up in those situations. I want to be able to present Jesus in the most honest light possible, not in some prepackaged idealism. Then the church can be imagined as a place where people experience real life. I don't know if you've noticed, but we've had a lot of speakers over the last couple of months. And they all have something in common. I don't know if you've picked up on this or not, but they all have issues with the church or have a story about some sort of thing that's happened to them in the church, right? All of them that have include Pastor Mike in that, and myself, and anybody, and all the other people who have come and spoke. I was struck by something Pastor Rachel said a couple weeks ago, where she said that she had not preached in a while. I think it was like a year and a half, but that the only place she felt comfortable coming back to was Newground. I think that says a lot about us as a community here. I think that demonstrates that we have a community that strives to be authentic. It's one of the reasons why it's one of our values, that we are not as judgmental as other places, and that regardless of who you are or what you've done, we're going to embrace you in love. And I just think that's just kudos to what leadership here has been doing and trying to help us see that as a value. And I think that we've been doing a good job with that, for us to consider having that same attitude towards the community and reaching out to the community like that. And showing the community that you can come to a place, you can worship God, you can have fellowship with people who are just like you, who have the same mistakes and faults. So our caring is not a platitude. It's something that we take very seriously here as a value. And that is unique. It may sound weird to say the church is a caring place. A church being a caring place is unique. Because aren't all churches a caring place? No, they're not. In fact, very, very few of them are. They have become political institutions that have agendas, and they have both political and theological agendas. And they've not, especially in recent years, have not been doing a very good job taking. I'm sure if we were to take a survey at the congregation, there'd be people here too, not just pastors, but people here too who have been hurt by the church. So a little story. I was just 16 years old, had been a Christian for about 6 months when I got a phone call. It was my girlfriend. Our pastor, who was only in his 40s, was in the hospital with what they think was a heart attack. I was pretty close to him and his daughter, who was part of her friend group. And since being a Christian, he had shown me nothing but kindness and love. So I inquired into what had happened. Apparently, leadership within the church was considering church discipline for him because he was going to let his daughter go to prom, and the stress had become too much for him. I know that may sound weird, right? But there was a time where dancing was a sin. Well, his daughter ended up going to prom, and they ended up leaving the church a few months later. I don't know if he was forced to or if he chose to, but regardless, the church split over that. That was my first church experience. Now, that's not just like an uncommon thing. It's not just like, well, maybe it was the denomination, or maybe that was just your experience or whatever. But things have not really changed. We've just dressed it up differently. Churches are splitting over masks and vaccines. It may not be dancing, but it's just clothed differently. Why have so many people been hurt by the church? That's the question that I've been struggling with. It is because a large part of the church has not fostered an environment of acceptance and trust. Instead, it's created environments of fear and intolerance. It's pursued power and prestige over humility and love. And I think that if we remember these things, that will help guide us on into the future. Here's the thing. Being authentic is difficult because it requires honesty that it just extends beyond the church. It requires that we be authentic in our life, because you can't be authentic just in church and not be authentic in life. It means you need to start being authentic to other people outside of the church, sharing with them your fears, your struggles, your triumphs, your victories. Authenticity is not like a switch where you just turn it on and turn it off. It becomes a part of who you are, your existence. Inauthenticity doesn't just affect those around you, it affects you. You cannot grow as a Christian and be inauthentic, because you're never being honest to yourself, you're never being honest before God. So how can you grow? How can your faith change? So to live in an authentic community, you must begin with an authentic life. So the church is an amazing institution, most amazing institution on the planet. It began with a few people. It was despised by the Romans, and at least 2 occasions was persecuted severely by the empire-wide persecution. So some things that we can learn from. How did it survive and how did it spread? So we started with 3,000 men and their families. What happened after that? Where did they go? How did the church become what it is today? So in the words of Paul Harvey, here's the rest of the story. Eventually, so they had been meeting in the temple alongside the Jews after all these Christians had been converted. And they started getting into arguments with the Jews, and the Jews eventually kicked them out of the temple. Early Christianity was primarily an urban faith, so they established themselves in city centers across the Roman Empire. Most people lived close together in crowded tenements. The faith spread as neighbors saw the lives of believers close up and on a daily basis. They saw how they took care of their poor, how they responded to persecution, how they treated one another, and how they treated those within their community. Now, I'm not just saying this as speculative, because this is documented. In fact, the early church father, Justin Martyr, from the 2nd century, wrote about this. He wrote to Emperor Antonius Pius to describe the believers. We formerly rejoiced in uncleanliness of life, but now love only. Before we use the magic arts, but now dedicate ourselves to the true and unbegotten God. Before we loved money and possessions more than anything, but now we share what we have and to everyone who is in need. Before we hated one another and killed one another and would not eat with those of another race. But now, since the manifestation of Christ, we have come to a common life and pray for our enemies and try to win over those who hate us without just cause. In another place, he wrote how those opposed to Christianity were sometimes won over because they could see consistency in the believer's life. Noting that the extraordinary forbearance when cheated in business dealings and their honesty and other dealings, professional dealings. Christians became known as those who cared for the sick. Many were known for healing that resulted from their prayers. Christians also started the first Meals on Wheels. By the year 250, they were feeding more than 1,500 of the hungry and destitute in Rome every day. When Emperor Julian the Apostate wanted to revive pagan religion in the empire around the mid-300s, he said this about Christianity. Christianity has been specifically advanced through the loving service rendered to strangers and through their care of the burial of the dead. It is a scandal that there is not a single Jew who is a beggar, and that the Christians care not only for their own poor, but for ours as well. In other words, the only way the church survived and thrived was because of authenticity. That they lived around others and that they shared who they were, not only who they were, but their resources too with those around them. The church has seen sharp decline over the years. especially in the COVID season. Churches splitting over things like vaccines and masks. The reason this happens is in these types of churches is a lack of authenticity. Many of these churches, we talked last week about creating safe spaces for people to disagree. Well, when churches split like this, they usually don't have stuff like that. They started on the premise that we all agree, that we are all in agreement theologically, politically, all these things. And so the only way to foster something like what we have here, which is a diverse group of people, is to have the thing in common, which is the gospel, and that nothing will separate us from that. One might be a liberal, one might be a conservative, but they still love each other, and just as they're supposed to, and just as they're taught to in Scripture. I think that a lot of these churches are selfish, and so that's something that we should be thinking about too, is how selfishness plays a role in not thinking about the other person. Or you can't be selfish and be thinking about the other person. I'm reminded of this technique that when you're having a conversation with someone, a lot of us are constantly in our heads thinking about what we're going to say next in response to whatever it is that the person that we're talking to is saying, instead of really just standing there and listening to what it is that they're saying. That I've always thought about and have tried practicing that as a way of not being selfish and not having to create an argument always or upstage the person that I'm talking to when I'm having a conversation, but really try to empathize with them and figure out where they're coming from and what it is that they're all about. We are lucky that we have the leadership that we've had at our church. They have put the congregation ahead of their own personal beliefs, their own political beliefs, their own ideologies, and have cared for us. And we should continue to elect leaders that do. They have stayed on focus and on track with the things that we have in common, which is the gospel. And that's how we'll survive on into the future too. It's by maintaining our authenticity and adhering to these values that we've been talking about the last few weeks. This church has done an incredible job of fostering community. Let's begin thinking how we can foster authenticity in the community around us. And by the way, that's the purpose of Table to Table. Table to Table is an attempt at extending our community outward. Table to Table is a trifecta of authentic community. It uses a table as a means of promoting authentic community among ourselves, with God, and with our community. As we think about our future and where we're heading from here, let us keep in mind that these values that we have as part of our mission or vision, where we're going, because they really will be our guiding light through communicating the gospel to a hurting world. Now, if you'll stand for the benediction. May you live into a lifestyle of authenticity, and may God provide for you opportunities to live authentically in this world.